Thank you very much, choir. That was lovely. In today's scripture, we hear a story about Jesus doing a couple of really, really nice things. He has dinner with a tax collector. He heals a girl who's dead. He manages to heal a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. And it's easy to hear those stories and think, well, these are just stories of Jesus being really nice. Of course we'd want to hear those stories. But what we miss, because we live in the 21st century rather than the first century, is just how shocking all of these stories were. They're not there because Jesus was being nice. They're there because people found these stories really disturbing. Why did he do that? And let me just unpack that a little bit. Why would it be a problem to have dinner with a tax collector? You know, in our time, if you lived next to someone who works for the CRA, you wouldn't have any qualms about having them over for dinner, right? You just invite them over for dinner. You'd have a nice dinner party. You're the tax person, no problem, let's have dinner. Any advice on how I can get a break on my taxes? You know, could be a very nice and possibly, money-saving dinner, but, you wouldn't worry about having it. You wouldn't keep it a secret from anybody else. But in Jesus' day, tax collectors were reviled. They were utterly hated because the Roman Empire was the entity they were collecting taxes for. And they hired local Jews to do the task. Now, no one likes paying money to a far-off country, particularly one as violent as the Roman Empire, who has its soldiers in Judea, and crucifies people who revolt or show any kind of resistance. So no one wants to pay the Roman Empire. And then to make things worse, tax collectors weren't paid a salary. The Romans expected the Jewish tax collectors to just charge extra so that they could support themselves. So every time the tax man came to your house to count how many animals you had and how much crops you'd had that year, they were also going to charge you extra so that they could get paid. So people hated tax collectors, which is why it was shocking that Jesus would pick out a tax collector from the crowd and say, hey, Matthew, why don't you come over for dinner? And then he ends up having dinner with multiple tax collectors. That was shocking, and that's one of the reasons that this story is in the book. Now, the other two stories are also shocking in their day. The little girl who is dead, this sounds like, wow, what a fantastic thing for Jesus to do. He's going to go heal a little girl who's dead. And in other translations, it's the synagogue official's daughter who is dead. But the thing about dead bodies in the first century in Judea is that they were considered unclean. You can't touch a dead body without becoming unclean yourself. And it takes 7 days for the uncleanness to wear off. So no rabbi in his right mind would touch a dead body. You'd leave that to other people. Because a rabbi can't go to the temple if they're unclean. You are ostracized from the temple until you are purified again. So when Jesus accepts this invitation to go touch a dead girl, because the official does say, I want you to lay your hands on her, he's asking Jesus to become unclean. And that is a shocking thing for him to be willing to do and go through with. And then the hemorrhaging woman. So this bleeding woman, which our translation says she had internal bleeding, scholars agree what was really going on was she'd been menstruating for 12 years straight. And in the Hebrew scriptures, if you have that sort of bleed going on, you are unclean, even if it's just regular. A regular period makes you unclean, and you need to stay separated from other people for 7 days. Only then, after that, once your period has ended, 7 days starts. So you've got the period plus 7 days that you're really supposed to stay away from other people and certainly stay away from the temple because you're unclean. This woman has been bleeding for 12 years. So she has been ostracized from society for 12 years. Anyone who touches her is unclean. So she's got to stay away from everybody if she's going to obey the rules. So the fact that she touches Jesus and Jesus doesn't get upset about it, that is really, really shocking. He shouldn't have had anything to do with her by the rules of their time. Jewish society was a purity culture, so it had these rules about what was pure and impure, clean and unclean. It separated people out based on these rules, and they were really hard and fast rules, which people recognized. They were written up in the scriptures which they read. They were the law of the land. Now, in Toronto, in Canadian society, we don't live in a purity society, right? You can have the tax man over. It's okay. You don't have to have a shower afterwards, right? And if you're menstruating, you don't have to avoid anybody, right? You may choose to tell some of your coworkers or family members that you're menstruating. That is up to you, but no one's going to shun you for it, right? We don't live in a purity culture. However, we do have informal ways of treating people as though they were unclean, as though they should be avoided. And if you want to see this in action, just get on the subway. On the subway, people choose who they're going to sit next to. And the Toronto subway system has become a de facto shelter system for our city's homeless people, and there's almost always people asleep, particularly in the morning, in the subways. And generally speaking, nobody sits next to them. They may have stretched out across the seats, which are 3 in a row, and they're trying to get a good night's or a good day's sleep because they couldn't sleep the night before. And there's usually, 2 seats right next to them, that sort of L shape on the subway. No one sits there. It's like, I don't want to sit there. And the other category of people on the subway who are avoided are people who seem to be having mental health episodes, people who are talking to themselves, sitting in a seat, rocking back and forth, talking to themselves. No one sits near them either. And if those people are pacing back and forth in the subway, people often will just avert their eyes and look down and say, I don't want any trouble here. Even though these people mean no trouble to anyone, but they're just walking back and forth. They're having a hard time. And it's funny because we make these subtle distinctions because a lawyer can be sitting on the subway with a headset on talking to a client, and that's not a problem. Talking to yourself on the subway is not actually a problem. It's the sort of feel that that person who is talking on the subway has that determines whether we're willing to sit next to them or not, right? Subway also saw this sort of drama during the pandemic. It was interesting, right? In the worst days of the pandemic, when everybody was supposed to wear a mask, there were always some people on the subway who didn't wear masks. They, too, did not have to worry about getting a seat because no one would sit next to them. Right? We make these subtle distinctions. It's not written down anywhere who you should avoid, who you can be next to, but we do act that way just the same. And we just sort of take a little bit of distance. We just separate ourselves from the people who we consider kind of unclean. There's another way that Canadian society does this too, but it's the opposite. It's not that we get away from them, but we tell them to get away from us. And since this is Reconciliation Day, we should remember that the way Canadian society set up our relationships with Indigenous peoples was that settlers would arrive in an area where Indigenous people were living. We would either take the land without permission or sign treaties, but either way we'd say, okay, now that we're here, you need to go somewhere else. Treaties were not agreements on how we could coexist in the same land. When the government of Ontario signed the first treaty to get what is now most of the GTA, they didn't say, hey, and now we're both going to live on this land. They said, no, we're taking this land and you should go somewhere else now. And that evolved into the reserve system, where Indigenous people were just supposed to stay on reserves, and those reserves, by law, had to be a certain distance away from the nearest town, because settlers and Indigenous people weren't supposed to mix. And in the Indian Act, it became very clear that if you wanted to leave a reserve, you needed to have a pass, and you could only get the pass by asking the Indian agent whether you were allowed to leave the reserve. And this was at the time when settlers often spoke of Indigenous people as dirty Indians, right? Dirty drunk Indian, dirty Indian. There was this whole attitude that Indigenous people shouldn't be where the settlers are, and they needed passes. And in the 1950s, when the South African government was trying to figure out how they should run apartheid, they studied the Canadian system, and they came up with their own pass system based on our pass system. So apartheid learned from us how to keep people separated, how to keep them in ghettos. Our society likes to separate people and shun them and keep them at the margins. We think in terms of categories: homeless and housed, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. We even teach our children how to think this way. If you think of the Harry Potter stories, all the kids come at the beginning of the school year and there's a sorting hat. And the sorting hat decides whether you're going to be with Slytherin or you're going to be in Gryffindor or Hufflepuff, right? We teach our children that people should be sorted into categories, as though the categories are more real than the people and the people can't change. It's just a habit of mind that we have, which we legislated through the Indian Act when it comes to Indigenous people. Now, in Christ's day, he lived in a culture which was even more defined by categories through purity culture, and yet he doesn't seem to care. He seems to delight in violating the rules of his society. So with the tax collector, he picks him out of the crowd, they sit down, have dinner, and when the people object, when the Pharisees say, hey, why are you having dinner with all these tax collectors? You know better than this. He says, and you should too, because in the scriptures, and he's quoting from Hosea, in the scriptures it says, our God requires mercy, not sacrifice. What he means by that is not animal sacrifice. It's not good enough to show up at temple and put the right sacrifices down and say, okay, I'm forgiven, I'm done, I'm good. No, what's important is that you live a merciful life where you're trying to establish right relations with other people. Now, in the story that we heard today, two of the interactions that Jesus has sound like just the model for Christian charity, right? Here's the tax collector, reviled by everybody. Jesus decides to have dinner with him. Very nice. The dead girl, Jesus decides to risk becoming impure to heal this poor little girl and bring her back to life. Also very nice. Jesus doing nice things. And Jesus isn't trying to change the system which created these situations. He's not trying to change the tax system, and we don't have any idea how the little girl got sick. Was it bad plumbing, poor health care? We have no idea. And Jesus doesn't do anything to change the circumstances which led to her death. He just seems to accept the circumstances, but he steps over the prohibitions so that he can be nice. Very similar to the way we do Christian charity now. Christians are expected not to ask questions about whether people are deserving of getting free clothes, like in our New Circles drives. There's no questions asked. We just deliver the clothes. You know, these people are deserving. They're cold. Here's the clothes. I don't know why you're cold. I don't know why you don't have enough money to buy clothes of your own. I don't care. Here are the clothes. We want to help. That is great. We do the same thing when we offer funds for out of the cold programs and so forth. It's a no questions asked system. So the two stories we heard today sound like a good model for that kind of Christian charity. But there's one more story, right? When the official says, can you please help my daughter? Jesus and his crowd of disciples had to walk across town to get to the official's house, go inside and heal the daughter. Along the way, though, there's this other story which is dumped in the middle about this woman who's been menstruating for 12 years. That story could have been left out, right? And the synagogue, the little girl's story would have made sense. Jesus was asked, he travels, he cures. Voila. Good story. How often do people bring people back from the dead? That would be a good story on its own. But Matthew decides to insert this story about the hemorrhaging woman because it's making a different point. This woman is oppressed in multiple ways. She has a physical ailment because she's bleeding. She has a social problem because people are avoiding her because she's bleeding. Her physical ailment means that she can't have children. And at that time, women were just expected to have children. That pretty much defined whether you were a woman, was whether you had children. So she's being held back from one of the things which defines her identity in her society, which may have been a great pain to her. So she's got all these strikes against her because of this ongoing menstruation. But here's the thing. She doesn't ask Jesus to cure her. She is unclean. Anyone she touches is unclean. She knows if she touches Jesus, she's unclean. If she barges through the crowd, which she must have because it was a crowded day, and touches him, she's making all those people unclean too. This is a disabled woman who is insisting on her rights, pushing through a crowd and getting cured without asking permission. This is not a passive cure, this is an active one on her part. Now, Jesus has every right to spin around and say, "Who touched me? You didn't have any right to do that. You should wait in line like everybody else, or ask." But he doesn't say that. Instead, he congratulates her and says, "Your faith has made you well." And friends, we need to take this story very, very seriously. Because it's easy for Christians to see charity as something that we do where we just help people who are in a bad way, but we don't try and change the system that put them into a bad way. But the hemorrhaging woman story says, if someone has been messed around by the system, by the way of life that they're living in, they have the right to change it. They have the right to protest it and insist on their autonomy, insist on their agency, and to fix that system. You can bet when she went home, she didn't say, "Oh, I'm glad I'm healthy now, but I accepted the fact that I should be ostracized for 12 years. No, if she accepted that, she wouldn't have insisted on being healed. She's standing up for herself and saying, "No, not only was it not fair that I was in this bad position, but the system that put me into that position is wrong." I was thinking about this the other day when I was at the Art Gallery of Ontario. If you go to the AGO right now, there's a wonderful exhibition of Inuit art by, I've got to get his name right, David Reuben Pektukin. It's 2 rooms full of just gorgeous Inuit sculpture. Really, really beautiful. And he was someone who attended residential schools. He was taken away from his culture, taken away from the Inuit people that he lived with in the Northwest Territories, and taught Catholic ways. And he's devoted his entire artistic career to saying, "Nope, I do not want to be silenced by the Catholic Western way of seeing the world, where everything's separated into categories. I want to show you how we see the world." And so that's what's captured in his sculptures. So here's a couple examples. A lot of the pieces are pieces which show a transformation of a shaman as the shaman merges with the spirit of another animal. In this case, it's a muskox. So the muskox has the face of a man, but the body of a muskox. And in Inuit culture, they don't see hard and fast divisions between people and animals and the land. Rather, they see a continuity, an interrelationship. The sorting hat doesn't apply in Inuit culture. Instead, things are much more interrelated. So here's another example. So this is a shaman merging with a fish spirit. The pieces are beautiful. I highly recommend you go see them. It's just amazing the transformations that happen. And what he captures and other Inuit artists capture is the values of their culture, which stress interdependence and indwelling, that human beings are on a continuum with the land and other animals rather than being separated from them. And so the sort of logic that he was taught in Catholic school about Jesus is up there, God is up there, you're down here, you better behave, because if you don't, you're going to go down there to hell. All of that makes no sense in Inuit culture. Rather, they are all fed by having an ongoing, life-giving, fertile interrelationship with the land around them. Later on today, after our service, we are going to dedicate the Miigwech Garden, which I spoke about earlier. Miigwech is a name that says thank you, means thank you in Ojibwe. The garden is full of indigenous plants, so plants which are native to Ontario. And the reason we got the money is because Faith in the Common Good gave us a grant because they would like to see more indigenous plants in all of our gardens, not just church gardens, but they hope that people will take the hint if we have them in church gardens. So why are these things important? Well, throughout the city, we have gardens which are full of European and Asian plants. And those plants evolved in Asia and in Europe, but not here. So our insects, our moths, our bees, our wasps, who pollinate plants, when they go up to one of these flowers, they didn't evolve with these flowers. So often what happens is they'll get into the plant, they'll rub around, the pollen will get on them, that's good. but they can't actually get the proboscis, that part of it's not a nose exactly, it's more like a syringe that pulls out of them down into the nectar. And the nectar is what gives them energy. It's that sweet, sweet, syrupy stuff which they take in, which fills them up. So they're going from flower to flower to flower, doing good job for the flower because they're spreading the pollen. It's good for the European flower, but it's not actually feeding the bee. And so, by planting indigenous and native plants, we're giving our indigenous and native insects a chance to not only pollinate our plants, but also be fed. It's a life-giving relationship. And just as Jesus went out of his way to heal a little girl so that she could have a life and perhaps go on to have children, and a woman insisted on pushing through a crowd so that she could stop being infertile, so she could get her life back, we are in our little way trying to restore some balance and relationship by establishing a relationship with the bugs and the bees and the insects in this neighborhood that have always been here, but which we haven't paid too much attention to their needs. We haven't been listening to their point of view because they can't speak for themselves. But so we're trying to speak for them and say, okay, here's some plants you can actually be nourished by. When Jesus was asked, why are you sitting with these tax collectors? He said, remember, we're supposed to show mercy. Mercy and relationship is the way we go forward. And that's a hard thing for our culture to recognize because we're so used to thinking in terms of separating things out into categories because that's efficient. But what's life-giving is when we see what each other need and we help each other, even if it's very different from what we need. That's challenging. And that's why that little story of the bleeding woman is stuck in there, so that we won't just think that it's us helping those who have been marginalized by the system that we created, but rather maybe there's a problem with the system itself. And we are called by Jesus to keep working on it, to keep helping other species and other people to try and bring about a world based on mercy and love and relationship. And that is indeed a blessing. Amen.